So Shahzia, it's wonderful to see you virtually. I have the pleasure of sitting adjacent to your exhibition, which is opening today, and you are in your studio. Firstly, I would like to welcome everybody that's watching and set the stage a little bit by telling them that this is your first exhibition with us at the gallery. It's indeed your first exhibition in New York for 9 years. It's a long absence for you to have been absent from New York, and New York's been missing you. But we are all extremely rewarded by a really extraordinary and remarkable exhibition that has been well worth the wait. And we thank you for that. It is rich and smart and deep and extremely timely as we sit here awaiting the results of the election. Everything that you are addressing in this show seems so prescient and so timely for this moment, and indeed timeless for all moments, in the sense that these are issues we should all be aware of. I'd like to start with talking to you about your thinking about how you composed the exhibition, because in the last 9 years, your work has grown exponentially to encompass many different aspects, to include very large-scale video and film presentations and very large-scale mosaic installations as well. So when you were thinking about the exhibition, can you set the table for us there and talk to us about how you thought about the exhibition, what you wanted to show, what you wanted to represent?
Yes, thank you, Sean, so much. I am really excited and proud of this exhibition. And it has, as you know, it's been, even with us, it's been a couple of years of conversation. So, yeah. So the fact that that also took its time, I think my work is so intuitive. And also, I think for me, developing a relationship with the gallery was really critical. And it didn't feel like, just to present an exhibition as soon as one joined the gallery. And I really appreciated that type of rapport and flexibility to find my footing and to see how, when I felt, I was ready to share the work. So the composition is really in a similar vein. It's understanding the space itself and wanting to show like the range of ideas and the range of the kind of multivalence of my work. And that's how I sort of thought of the show and the composition, was that I wanted to be able to show the strength of the work in that manner, without compromising, one work over the other, and having sort of a thread run through it. And I think that thread that runs through it is really about how how I engage with drawing, and how the medium of drawing is it's like this flexible medium, almost like a libretto that I think contains the work.
Well, if as a beautiful reference, if drawing is your libretto, then people are going to be very happy in the exhibition hearing not just the libretto, but the orchestration of the entire exhibition, as you say, is very much based on drawing, but it is expanded in such a remarkable way. I mean, in the last 9 years, you've expanded not only the scale of the work in a very ambitious way, but you've expanded into mosaic with a very ambitious commission that you received, that you've now continued to work in that medium into more domestic scale works. the video and film pieces, obviously. And this is an opportunity. There are 3 video film pieces in the show. 2 earlier works that are very important that have been seen around the world but hadn't been seen in New York necessarily. So we're really excited to be able to show those as a kind of almost mini retrospective of that area of work. But I suppose the most surprising work in the exhibition, and one of the most recently completed, is the sculpture. I mean, we have not seen sculpture from you before. Can you talk to us about the move into 3-dimensional work and what prompted that and how exciting it's been for you?
Absolutely. I think because when I'm thinking of drawing, for me, drawing is very conceptual. And I'm aware that I have a very good draftsmanship. That's just often been talked about in terms of my biography and having, done a focused sort of engagement with a very particular miniature painting tradition and all of that. So that for me is something that just naturally comes along. But when I think of drawing, I'm also thinking of drawing in terms of space and velocity and kinetic nature of drawing. And I think the animation has allowed me for many years now to expand on that idea. And I think sculpture was very much a natural a natural direction in that way, that to think of forms and to think of the legibility of forms in space. And also when I had this opportunity that, okay, I'm going to make a sculpture, I really thought that for me, what made most sense was to look at the protagonists that are already present in the work and to really cull that out first, and not necessarily be like, oh, and that way of like looking in depth into the ideas that are already prevalent in the work, but not necessarily have been explored further. Like, I think that is something that happens naturally in terms of how I create work. My work is so research-based that often like I have to push further and further to see and test the validity of juxtapositions and different elements that seem to sort of percolate in the work, but then how to see what type of relationships can continuously evolve, and so that you have multiple vantage points. And while I'm sort of orchestrating all of that, I still am wanting like a very visceral, emotional experience to come from the work for the viewer. And so that's where the sculpture didn't seem daunting. It seemed like very much the way I have moved the drawing with music, the drawing with animation, the drawing with writing, and the drawing.
Sure.
Yeah, like it's a very organic, natural way in my head in terms of the alliances I create through the medium of drawing.
I mean, it's a really complex, both a complex form, but intellectually a very complex sculpture. I mean, there are 2 entwined figures in this kind of hierarchical relationship, or certainly in dialogue with each other, looking into each other's eyes, both female, one taken from the Western tradition. It's actually taken from a Bronzino, an allegory with Venus and Cupid. And the other figure is an Indian Devata figure, which is taken from a work in the collection, or references a work in the collection, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But they're in this incredibly dynamic relationship, which feels like it's challenging both the historical canon of both traditions to create something new, but in a very contemporary way. I mean, it's quite sexy. It's a very sexy sculpture. I mean, to be very basic about it. I mean, can you talk about that that juxtaposition of these very traditional figures in this relationship and this challenge that's occurring in the intertwining to create something completely new and contemporary.
Yes, so I think that's why I chose that particular image, is that though I had sketched that idea a long time ago, right? I had been interested in creating a relationship with the outcasts, so to speak, outcasts of the classical canon. So mannerism and the Indian aesthetic as the outsider witnesses to a very one-sided history. And that playfulness had informed that idea initially. But then as I know and I understand how sometimes two-dimensional works can exist in a different manner, you know, a three-dimensional work has a very different expectation that it demands from the viewer itself. So I kind of was like, if I pull this idea out, then I have to resolve it. Like I will have to solve it, because you get away with a lot in a two-dimensional representation.
Yeah.
So that's where the challenge for me was, that the form had to be incredibly agile and valid. So working with the models, and then also that it had, you know, there were areas the sketch does not have a view from the left or the right or the back. So we had to really think in terms of the movement throughout from every aspect. And then,
and interestingly, sorry to interrupt, but interestingly, I just wanted to point out that it wasn't like you went and chose two static images from the historical canon, but you actually started the process working with dancers.
Yeah, well, definitely one of them was dancer and one of them wasn't. But the fact is that I think working with women already was, you stepped more than halfway into the work, because I was going to work with people, with the bodies, with the forms, with the sentiment that, you know, that there was a possibility in that particular, the legibility of that formal configuration seemed like, you know, it could happen. And then immediately that was really clear. But then I also knew that for me, it was important how the surface of bronze itself would function, and what type of significance the treatment would read as. So I didn't want, just because they were oppositional of sorts, that the Devi had to be, the Apsara, the Devata had to be treated in a particular manner, and then the more naturalized, stylized a sculpture of the Venus had to be, you know, treated in a in sort of the tradition of the bronze, French bronzes, for example. So like it was pretty, that's where the finer, the more the complexity only starts to evolve when, you know, as you're resolving it. And that's where I wanted it to be like a painting. Like I really thought of it just like the drawing.
Right. And that's a beautiful segue, because I was just about to ask you about this. Having had the pleasure of being with you at the Foundry when you were patinating the piece, you really were working on it as if it was a painting. And both the figures are unified by this very painterly surface.
Yeah, and that's so true. And I think I feel like the bronze feels very vulnerable, and just like the porosity of the paper for me is, it has many layers of color. So like you know, the colors come through, but it was also like in most of my work, there's multiplicity of intent and meanings. So just the way the different ochres kind of peek through the layers of oxidized green and layers of some of the flesh colors, like you can see that the colors have been put in various layers when you up close. It's not sort of like one kind of one type of a skin color.
Yeah.
It's reminiscent of a multiplicity. And that is how sort of drawing with ink and gouache works for me. So I kind of thought of it in a very similar way. And I also knew that, color would allow me to play with this idea that classical statuary is not necessarily just devoid of color, not just sort of lily white, as often is one's imagination. And so sort of reading a little bit on that was fueling me also to really embrace the idea of color.
Well, of course, classical sculptures, both in the Western canon historically and in Asia, were very, very highly colored. I mean, most of the things that we see now that have come down through the eons to us no longer or only retain traces of their original coloration. But the sculptures were very highly colored as these very powerful sort of emblematic representations of us as humans, but almost in a more godlike way. They were superhuman in a way. I mean, one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about this is that you've avoided any notion of white or color in either of these two figures. They are actually painted. They're literally painted with the patina and flame to produce this overall color that gives them this sense of being liberated from the surface of a piece of paper or liberated from a canvas. So they are three-dimensional paintings. They're paintings in the round almost.
Yeah, I'm glad you think that way, because I think it was a very lengthy process, a learning curve also, painting and then doing sandblasting it all over again and starting it all over again, like till I really, I played with the new material, with the surface of bronze in an incredibly intuitive way too. And I felt that that is what was needed, because as it is, it's a very dramatic reference of two very specific archetypes or, representations of feminine forms that are already pretty much burdened in a way with their each representation and different histories. So I kind of knew that, I had to find a way where it felt buoyant and afloat and not pulled down and not too didactic, and just, find a way. So I think, again, that when you were asking about the composition of the exhibition, I do believe that this sort of intuitive path really comes from having such a fundamental belief in the capacity of drawing. Like, I feel like drawing really can traverse across boundaries of race and culture and nationalities and religion, and all these zones of tension where every particular category is vying for a particular type of representation. I feel like drawing allows me to cross those boundaries in a very forward-looking manner.
Yeah, I mean, the entire exhibition is underpinned by your drawing practice, and you made reference to the fact that I think very modestly that this comes quite naturally to you. It is something that flows out of you. It's to you, drawing is very natural. I feel it's almost like breathing with you. It's something, it's a place that you go to almost without thinking. And the entire exhibition, whatever medium you're working in, is underpinned by this beautiful fluidity in drawing. And I'd like to talk about the weight of meaning that drawing can carry. You've made and I think that also is a thread or a spine that runs through the show. You've made a very beautiful 4-minute, 16-second new video called Reckoning, which is in the front gallery. Excuse me. And it's a video that is based on drawing and a very fluid moment, but it really deals with some weighty concerns. I mean, it deals with a moment of reckoning between subject matter such as a migrant or citizen, woman and power, the human and nature. And it's got very dramatic sequences of tussling and tension, almost fighting in the video as these things try to reconcile themselves. And towards the end of the video, nature seems to take over, and the duality that exists in nature seems to win the day. Can you talk about the drawing process in terms of video and the film pieces?
Yes, I have been very fortunate that I have worked with Patrick for such a long time, like, I don't know, 20 years now together. So in that way, I think when one is conceiving not just the overarching particular theme of a video animation, but more in terms of the ability of an image to move, and to move in ways that it really becomes compelling and more than what it is on paper. And I think on paper, you can always, with shading and with other tools, you can really create a very strong experience of the drawn. But when that image is dislodged and placed into space, and you allow it to move, there's a danger for me that it can be hijacked by the experience of the software. And I've always kind of fought that. I stick to something which I know will makes the closest sense to me, and which is keep the drawing more present, and and in that sort of, so what I wanted to say was, like, at the very beginning is a struggle. The struggle is that how can the image move in space and not look frivolous, or not, why make it move in space? So the reasoning there has to really be something that compels you to then build the entire piece. So that's the struggle that I kind of have in the work itself as a concept. And I think expanding and pushing that over time really allows the kinetic, this chemistry to come through in the work. And there's been like a lot of sensitivity to maintain that integrity through all the different pieces.
Yeah, and I mean, you've talked about your long-standing 2-decade-long collaboration with Patrick, and it does feel that you are able, the two of you, to work remotely very intuitively on these works together. But the sort of other personality in that partnership is the music of Du Yun, which is so moving and so beautiful, and fits so perfectly with the drawing and the animation of the drawing. I mean, it's a very seamless, really impressive pirouette three of you manage in these works. How important to you is that? I mean, we always talk about how music can carry emotion so quickly through us. How important to you is the impact of the music in these pieces?
Oh, very important. I think so what you experience in the work itself is also behind the scene a very deep, complex, wonderful collaborative relationships of individuals. There's a lot that gets fed into that dynamic. So I have really worked at that relationship with Diane over a long time, over 10 years. And in that process, we have traveled together to different places where we've created projects that engage with with poets and in languages that were the vernacular was of the region. We have worked with this idea of geography, with this our sort of like this interest in this concept of tradition, you know, without being burdened by it, but being incredibly intuitively aware that when one is engaging in this sort of rupture or dismantling or disruption, it is moving forward. And what is that? It's such a broad topic. Like, how do you move that idea forward? But I think that just has been sort of a common thread too in terms of our partnership. And just to be more simple, like I will share the drawings with Diane. I will share ideas with both Patrick and Diane over a long period of time. And some of those ideas will not necessarily fall right back into the project at hand, but they may start a new work. And then we will come back to it at another time. So there's a lot, and you know, there's a lot of back and forth and crossing into each other's work and constantly learning. And I think that's because there's a lot of trust and issues around ownership and trust and, you know, curiosity that feeds the creative desire of people. Like, I think that's I feel like one is very lucky to gravitate to certain people, but I also feel like it's very important to maintain these relationships. And for me, collaboration is a very serious, long-term idea where the, yeah, like I've said before many times, the autonomy of the other person's voice really exists within the work.
Shahzia, I love the fact that you've talked about disruption and rupture, because it's, you know, it's such an appropriate concept for the postmodern era, and especially related to drawing. I mean, Picasso famously, you know, said at the beginning of the 20th century that unless you had mastered the classical tradition of drawing, you did not know how to fracture it and break it and tear it apart. And of course, as we all know, he was a consummate draftsman, but he started off his career as being capable of very beautiful representational drawings, having looked extensively, of course, at Degas and others. I think this idea that you come from a very strong tradition, you were trained very formally within a very strong tradition, and you're, to me, if I may use the word, you are a MacArthur recipient. Your genius is that you've been able to respectfully work with that tradition, but at the same time disrupt it and rupture it and take it apart and reassemble something that feels so much more ambitious than the place where you started. I mean, are you very conscious of doing that in the work all the time, or is it just something that you naturally gravitate to?
No, it's very conscious, totally conscious. But every single time I start as if I have to start, you know, it's the first time. Every time is the first time. And every time.
Isn't that nerve-wracking? I mean, you must be completely freaked out every time you sit down to make a work.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that it is that you can't bargain any other way. That's I kind of understood that that's my path in life. and though whatever angst I may have at that time, I do believe that in that struggle is, you know, on the other side, when you come out on the other side, it's such a learning process also. It's, you take the risks and you fail at times, and then, you know, something else comes about, but it's this constant journey. And
does it get any easier after almost 3 decades? Does it get any less terrifying and daunting? Does it get easier, do you think?
I think for a long time I was on the search that it had to get easier. And I was like, it has to get easier. And now I know that it doesn't. It just doesn't. I wish I had accepted that, maybe like 15 years ago or something.
But perhaps if it got easier, it'd now be even more worrying to you that it got easier.
Yeah, no, I think the biggest worry I have is complacency.
Right.
I am so afraid and fearful whenever I detect complacency, not just within myself, but elsewhere too. Like my antennas are always high up, and complacency really bothers me a lot. And I think that that is one thing that that keeps one, of course, curiosity and all these other things are there, but one knows when one is putting more than the 100% into any direction, even if the outcome is not exactly, whether the outcome you even put out into public or not. But
sure,
that I think really speaks to me in terms of how I constantly kind of this ongoing search and pursuit.
Well, I think the word challenge is the right one. I mean, I think you are somebody who challenges yourself consistently, not just in terms of excellence, but in terms of opportunity and lack of comfort, to push into these other areas and to really challenge yourself. And I think that's a mark of a great artist, is when they are not just remaining in their comfort zone. Now, in 2015, you received, I think this is so remarkable, you received a large-scale permanent public art commission from Princeton University for an absolutely enormous 66-foot-high glass, ceramic, and marble mosaic entitled "Ecstasy is Sublime." That is probably about as far as one can get from a miniature painter that one could possibly imagine. And it spurred this incredible engagement with a very traditional and historic medium, which is working with stained glass and mosaic. And I'd like you to talk about how did you make that leap from the small piece of paper in front of you many years ago to this 66-foot public commission mosaic?
So, in terms of shifting the scale, I was working always with this polarity of sorts, where I did large scale wall drawings, a lot of large scale projections, but definitely in terms of like actual physical making murals, I was doing that in the 90s. So the scale didn't daunt me. I think the challenge at that time was to come up with the material, the longevity of a material for permanent public artwork. And that, that is what I had not yet really explored. Obviously, like works on paper they come with a lot more complexity. You can't exhibit them all the time. And I think that's where I was really surprised when I won the project proposal. Like, I think there were at least 10 other candidates too, but my focus had been so much on the concept, on drawing links with power structures, with colonial histories and routes and East India Company and all of that. So when I wasn't really expecting to have won that. So when I did win it, I was like, oh God, I gotta now come up with a solution. And that was incredibly motivating, exciting, and had to be done in a very, very short amount of time. Like, I think within less than a year, 10 months or so. So yeah, glass became very much like the idea of glass, because it would allow a malleability of sorts of the image, but also a playfulness with light. Like, I knew that light would be a very strong idea in the work. And obviously then working with the right partner. So working with Franz Meer in Munich, the glass studio workshop, really that led to a wonderful relationship, which has been ongoing. So,
and indeed, some of the imagery that we can see in the work at Princeton is echoed in the exhibition, both in the video parallax and in one of the very large watercolors, the horizontal watercolor. So that, you know, the work's constantly feeding both forward and backwards upon itself.
Yeah, definitely. I think the idea of the pixel beautifully equated with the idea of the unit of the mosaic. Like, it was so natural to come from that pixel to mosaic. It was actually much more easier conceptually for me than to think of drawing and then finding, you know, sending a drawing to be made into a mosaic like that.
Yeah, trying to find an equivalence.
Yeah. And that's why I think that particular work has so much depth. It's this piece, Ecstasy is Sublime, Heart as Vector. It has a very different, because I created it in a way that it's almost like a moving image, like, and a still of the moving image. So there's kind of two different stories are happening. There are two different surfaces. There's a surface at the bottom, and then there's a surface at the top. And I knew that the mosaic could capture that type of complexity, and without it being just like a paint by, you know, color representation of an image.
Well, it also has a lovely reference to scroll painting as well. I mean, it feels like a giant scroll that's being unfurled in front of you, I think, at times, the way it kind of moves through the space. The reference to the pixelization of an electronic image and the digitization, pixelization relationship to the mosaic is one I wanted to talk to you about, because it is one of those unexpected juxtapositions that's quite perfect, actually. If you think about the pixelization of an electronic image and how you would translate it into a static fixed image, the idea of glass and mosaic is an almost perfect medium, but not the most obvious one to have thought of.
Yeah. Why do you think it's a more perfect medium?
I think it's so unexpected that one would go there from a video image, but because of its fractured nature and the fact that you can build it up and rearrange it, sort of fracture it and recompose it, it just seems like a perfect equivalence somehow.
Yeah, I think that, of course, for very obvious reasons, that's very true. This idea of again, a rupture of sorts, or you know, fracturing something which just lends itself. So again, I think that tension where you can think of the mosaic as unit by unit, you're building something, but at the same time, you can think of it as something that is really rupturing, or, you know, kind of creating kind of a distancing of sorts from a perfect representation. So it's almost, when I think of it, I think really why I wanted to get into animation a long time ago is like, whenever I looked at the historical paintings, they felt so full of energy, like as if there was a whole world at the borders, outside of the borders, that was buzzing at the edges, like they were alive. And I felt like, yet they were so perfectly constructed that if one element I removed, it would just unravel in space. Like every time I looked at these paintings, that's where my mind went, that I needed to unravel them. And I think that's how I would really think of the mosaic itself too, is that when we were making these mosaics, every single selection of the particular glass or the stone tile is significant. It's not just random. Every single thing, because when you come up close, you'll realize that unexpected forms and, you know, almost three-dimensional larger scale things are popping out in unexpected ways. It's like,
Sure.
so that has been really a very hands-on idea in terms of what to get out of this collaboration of the image and the mosaic.
Yeah, I mean, there's an earlier example of, I mean, you were talking about, you know, the energy of looking at traditional miniatures and the buzziness of them. I mean, they are storytelling, they are allegory. There is literal example of this when you worked on the project in Philadelphia, where you took a traditional manuscript and you used it as a starting point for an animation, where the figures literally do start to walk off the surface of the paper and into a different type of organization and composition, and make a different world and start whirling in space. There's a beautiful work that in the exhibition called A Rose, which we're looking at the moment, which is almost feels to me like a kind of fulcrum around which the entire exhibition revolves. And it is indeed a circular image. It's an image that makes one think of animation and cartoon and allegory, and this circular motion of these figures in space starting to transform literally before our eyes. Can you talk about the animation of it? It almost feels like you've animated a static image in this piece. It's the reverse of a film piece or a video.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very interesting way that, you know, when I, like, for me, it is really this it has bloomed or blossomed and it has floated to the surface, and it's a flower, or it's the opium flower. It is a form which is very much full of detail, but it's also pretty much untethered to any particular environment. So it's all these opposing ideas, and it was a kind of a playfulness on the traditional representation of the skirt, you know, kind of like, how could what else could I do to that very static image of the female figure?
Yeah.
And that's where I kept thinking, like, what else could I do where I don't necessarily have to, like, you know, shred it, or where I can keep it and yet allow it to move into another sort of dimension. And
yeah, I mean, when I first saw the image, I immediately thought of watching dervishes in Istanbul, which of course are men who are dancing in trance-like quasi-religious motions, not women. And this image depicts women, but it did have that sense of great swirling animation and motion, and immediately flipped me into a different kind of tradition, a very ecstatic version of an image, actually.
Yeah, I didn't even think of it like in the dervish. I would have, if I had thought of it, I would probably have cringed and said, no, can't go there.
Oh.
But it's interesting that you are thinking like that, because I think, again, you know, when I was making this image, I kind of put it aside. I wasn't even expecting to bring kind of the way it anchors the show now. Like,
Yeah.
that's not where the idea for the show or this image was headed.
Yeah.
So that's what happens, sort of course, behind the scene, how things continuously inform each other. But for me, this was really about how I could bring some kind of fluidity into a mosaic too.
Yeah, exactly. Well, things get a little bit more intense on one of the other walls in the exhibition. You said one of the initial ideas for this exhibition was to create a body of work showing symbols of extraction countered with images of abundance. And there's a series of related drawings in the show that really grow out of your deep engagement with concern about climate crisis. And the idea of symbols of extraction, I think, goes very well with some of the other major themes that you're talking about in the exhibition, not just to do with colonialism, but to do with power, to do with structures, exchange, migration, etc. So there's a series of quite abstract looking drawings that are rooted in reality. And they come, there's 4 of them. They're generically, we referred to them during the preparation for the show as the Christmas tree drawings. Christmas trees are things that are referred to in the oil industry. They are the derrick heads where the oil is pumped to the surface and have lots of wheels and chains on them and are very carefully guarded and locked up. And you saw an image of a magazine from 1962 with some people standing next to one of these derrick tops. Now there's a kind of very interesting metaphor here to refer, most of the oil at that time is being pumped in the Middle East, and yet these things, the engineers, many of the engineers were from colonial countries, and these things were referred to Christmas trees, which is a very Christian relationship, a very Christian image. What you've chosen to do is turn them into these rather portentous and powerful hybrids that exist between those two forms or cultures. So of course they have a Christmas tree reference, but they're really to do with this symbol of extraction of wealth, aren't they?
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that because yes, of course, that particular time when I was doing research for Parallax, I did come across, I was looking at a lot of British petroleum magazines. So of course the image came, that first confrontation with that particular photograph and the idea sort of emerged then. But I think in this particular series, these are incredibly elaborate paintings. And yeah. I think each of them goes in some other direction. Like the armature may be there, but it's really much more like in the oil and poppy. I was really also looking at of course behind the scene that there's a lot of the sort of US long-term intervention in Afghanistan, and then I'm like, all of that is there, that's been there in all my life. It's like the backyard of having grown up in Pakistan. Like that's been going to inform what I do at many other levels. But I think in this particular work, there is it's the tree is sprouting the poppies too. It's
these are very large scale drawings, paintings on paper, and certainly in the middle image of the 3 that we're looking at right now, the red one, the poppy is very, very present. And of course the idea of the extraction, the growing of a natural material that is then in a way perverted, extracted and perverted, and turns into this drug that causes so much damage and so much harm in our cultures, nowhere more so perhaps than Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Yeah, so it is also, there's this whole thing of like the transnational, kind of the how it may be happening there, but we all are connected to it in that way, the sort of larger global privatization that connects all of us, how all of us are part of this big major economic kind of connections. And that's where I think like the tree even though like the idea of the Christmas tree is not just necessarily it is a very Christian iconography, but it's
Yeah.
also a commercial, global, commercially
Sure.
prevalent iconography. So there was all of that I could obviously play with, but I also wanted that when you're confronted with these large scale drawings, you know, the sort of, again, the very visceral nature of pigment and layers of ink that has gone in the making of it. It almost looks like it's
Yeah.
the oil is dripping and pooling. So
And these
you
are
can't see a lot of that in these large shots, but
Sure.
you can definitely, when you're up close with the drawings, you really see them.
And these are big works on, you know, the big paintings. They're quite physically intimidating when you stand in front of them.
Yeah, they are about 8 or 9 feet.
Right. So I'd like now to just, I mean, we've been talking for 50 minutes, and honestly, Shahzia, I could talk to you for a lot longer, but I'm conscious of the viewers' time as well as ours. I'm having fun. We can carry on privately. But we've talked a lot about drawing. There are 2 cabinets in the exhibition of much more intimate scale drawings, which in a way constitute a kind of spine of thinking for me that flows through the exhibition. And there's a group of works called Empire Follows Art, States of Agitation. And I want to talk about this for a second, because I know that you are a very good friend of the Pulitzer Prize winning playwright Ayad Akhtar, whose new book, if you have not read it, Homeland Elegies, is wonderful and really deals with the dichotomy of growing up American, a Muslim American in America at this post 9/11 moment. And you've said of this group of drawings, each drawing in the Empire series depicts a state of struggle, of being caught variously between monetizing worlds, vocabularies, competing cultures and histories, from the vantage point and interplay of both sides of the hyphenate Pakistani American or Muslim American. The drawings reflect on the underlying currents in the political divisions of American society. And this is something that Ayad speaks brilliantly to in his novel, where he really is making the case that this is not as much a racial or cultural issue. It has now grown to the status of being a fundamental economic issue that faces us all and that affects everything that we speak to or care about or identify with in terms of culture and migration and identity. This series of drawings, I think, really powerfully digs into that subject matter. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think you're very right. Like, of course, I think, like, you know, a lot of this work has been also has been fueled with my conversations with Ayad Akhtar for the last like couple of years. But definitely, I think when one is, when I'm creating work, I'm not obsessing over identity. I'm not, you know, I am very much engaged for years with a canon of iconography, of visual vocabulary that is stemming from, for lack of a better word, like manuscript paintings that geographically go from all the way from East Europe into China. Like, you can't call them miniature painting. They are not determined by size, but like the Indo-Persian, but majority of this manuscript, Indian, Persian, Turkish artworks, so much of it, that truncated history exists also in institutional, in storages in the museums. So for me, that has been really kind of where I have dug and looked at the archives and, keep looking and discovering new images to look at. So that process is not because how do you define, how do you weave an identity there? How does, when somebody comes along and frames, oh, is your work Pakistani, is your work Muslim, is your work culturally specific? Yes, of course it is all of that, and it's culturally specific to the colonial histories of plundering also. So in that sense, it's a broadening of sorts, where it's not just the armature of identity that's going to be enough anymore for people to come in and hijack or put frameworks around the work. And I think that's where I found really exciting to have this opportunity to engage with Akhtar's work, was also because he was also exploring some of those ideas, and so a lot of this work has come from that conversation too.
Yeah.
And you can I think in the nature of who one is, of course, having many hyphenated identities is one thing, but I'm also centering my story in terms of who it's coming from me.
Sure, of course.
So I'm no longer interested in responding just as someone on the periphery. I think that's the shift that has happened, is like there are many people with different stories, and each of that can be centered and is of significance and importance. And I think that's where we're seeing this sort of idea of who gets to determine what is American art, who gets to determine what is America. There are multiple voices now, much more visible and present. Of course, there needs to be much more, but that shift that I see that has happened over the last 20 years that I've been here is really also what this work is kind of exploring and embracing.
Yeah, and I mean, look, the fact of the matter is that America has spent 247 years trying to suppress that multiplicity and richness in many respects. I mean, or trying to exclude the immigrant, or trying to exclude the migrant and their voices. And, whether it was when the Irish came in waves, that they were vilified and pushed to the margins. It's been a subject which America has not dealt with well for a very long period of time. And there is a reckoning attached to that. And it is a moment at which that reckoning is becoming part of the conversation in a very powerful way, and in a very important way too. Because one of the things that one ignores at one's peril in America, and I'm an American citizen, is that we are all fundamentally from somewhere else. This is a very young country. And if we don't embrace those conversations and that richness, of what everybody can bring to the table, we're all impoverished by it. And I think, that's one of the great triumphs of this show, is that you're giving voice to so many different views in the exhibition in such a rich and intellectually rewarding way. I want to put you on the spot a little bit. There's a smile. I want to put you on the spot a little bit, because I'm gonna ask you. It's a bit of a cheeky question. You said that you don't want it to be about you and about the specificity of you. You want it to be about, it is coming from you, of course. There's one drawing in the show. There's two drawings in the show, but there's one drawing in the show I want to ask you about. It's a recent drawing called Embrace. It's 17 by 11 inches, and it depicts two women embracing. And I don't know if we can get that image up. We'll probably be able to do so fairly quickly. When I saw this drawing, it bore an uncanny resemblance to somebody I know. And I wanted to ask you if it is a specific self-portrait.
No. To be honest, it's not a specific self-portrait, but at the same time, I have many self-portraits.
Yeah.
There are many sides to who I am.
It's the drawing on the left that we're looking at.
The drawing to the left, yeah. And then the other one, the one in color, if we can share that too.
Yeah.
I think there's been this question constantly. I think many artists would get that, like, is that a self-portrait, or, is it really, who is the story? Who is that person? Like, people want to know what is real, what is the real thing. And I think that's also the tension that I'm interested here, is that kind of the playfulness that,
it's a bit like saying, will the real Shahzia Sikander please stand up and be identified?
Yeah. So yes. So this it's not a self-portrait, and at the same time, it is very much a part of who I am.
Yeah. So Shahzia, we are approaching an hour, which was the absolute outside of what we would expect anybody to sit through, but it's been so fascinating. We could go on for ages. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. Firstly, the exhibition is opening today, and it will be going on until the end of the year. It is a beautiful, intense, dense exhibition, more than well worth waiting for the 9 years that we've had to wait for Shahzia's triumphant return to New York. We're very, very proud to be presenting it at the gallery. But you're also going to be the subject of a major traveling retrospective entitled Shahzia Sikander, Extraordinary Realities, which will open at the Morgan Library here in New York in June of next year, co-organized with RISD, and it will be at RISD in November 2021, and then it's going to go to the MFA Houston in the spring of 2022. There's going to be a very important book coming out on that occasion, a major new monograph on you, Shahzia Sikander, Extraordinary Realities, and that's going to be a really extensive examination with some incredible writers of your work from 1987 to 2003. So it's going to give us a really good overview of that period, and sort of grounds the body of work we're now showing at the gallery, which I think you've done just an absolutely beautiful job of orchestrating and curating for us. So Shahzia, I wanted to thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation, for disabusing me of the fact that it's a self-portrait so elegantly, and for being so forthright about your thinking behind the show. Everybody has to come and see this show. It's a great show that has enormous resonance and prescience, and is a really, really beautiful, beautiful, intense, smart show. As you are, thank you for spending this time with us today. It's really been a huge pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you. Really, really appreciate it. Super excited about the exhibition, and so wonderful to actually work with you and everybody else at the gallery.
It's our very distinct pleasure, trust me. And a little bird tells me that you might be visiting us on Saturday to enjoy the show for a little while. So any Shahzia Sikander fans, there might be a sighting on Saturday at the gallery.
Yes.
In the meantime, it's lovely to see you, and we'll see you very soon.
Wonderful.
Take care. Thanks, Shahzia.
Thank you. Thank you.